Regrettably, I didn't properly indoctrinate myself on the works of David Cronenberg until recently, but shotgunning his work and capping it off with Crimes of the Future felt like I was at the end of 2001 and watching the space baby emerge in real time through the canvas of my local Regal cinema. Body horror isn't a genre I've ever claimed to have much expertise on, and it always seemed more or less self-explanatory to me. It seemed obvious that societal fears manifest themselves in horror, and body horror specifically has to do with our relationship with our bodies, and I kind of figured that was that. Cronenberg is a very skilled craftsman and has a practical sensibility that already makes his special effects feel tactile and grotesque enough to have earned him the title of Master of Body Horror. But the degree to which he uses that ability, and takes the body and uses it as a vehicle to explore evolution and the nature of consumption and desire, I was not prepared for. His movies paint a holistic picture of the relationship between these things, using body horror and sex to illustrate his ideas, but more importantly, he uses the films themselves as self-referential examples of the nutrients we consume, and his filmography has become this semi-organic, semi-synthetic organism in its own right that's emblematic on a macro level of the bodies and weird devices he puts in his movies. This full-circle, fractal quality, and the repeated ideas that foster it, have led him to become one of my favorite filmmakers. Naturally, his son's desire to follow in his footsteps and become a body horror director himself yielded pretty big shoes to fill. And maybe this is the most obvious direction to take a video about a nepotism baby in, but considering how closely Brandon Cronenberg follows his father's framework, I think some comparing and contrasting here has a little more value than, say, comparing Coppola's. Brandon currently has 3 feature films: Antiviral, Possessor, and the most recent, Infinity Pool. And from movie 1, the resemblance is pretty immediate. Uncanny contortions of the body mixed with machinery, sexual depravity, predictions or at least thought exercises on the future of vices, and I think what especially makes the comparison fruitful is that, on an aesthetic level, Brandon has undeniable prowess. I don't think there'd be any point to making this video if his work was just failed imitation, but he has nailed the act of creating an image that gets under your skin. Unafraid of cutting to a tight close-up of some ungodly object piercing through skin, or body parts being mangled up. He has a fascination with analog machinery, despite the fact that he's leaned so heavily into digital photography, and he's found an individual voice within that mode of shooting. While David has also transitioned into digital filmmaking with his past few films, a lot of the potency of his work comes from stark contrast between the body horror elements and the general look of the rest of a given film. That's not the case for all of them. He certainly has some moody looking movies, but a lot of them, especially early on, have bright, high-key, studio-lit aesthetics, which makes the moments of terror feel like they're infiltrating what we were previously watching. And even his digital stuff taps into the uncanny, using this new evolution of bright, artificial image processing to contrast the carnage happening on screen. Ironically, or perhaps not ironically at all, his movie with the most outward face of grit has the happiest ending out of any of his movies. Brandon, on the other hand, is all about communicating a sense of dread and terror with the camera from the get-go, letting us know exactly what we're in for. So he loses that sense of juxtaposition, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. That foreboding filmmaking is just a different instrument he arranges his films with. Antiviral actually does have a sort of cosmopolis sense of satirical, ironic artifice, but as Brandon's come into his own, he's become more earnest with the camera, and we're to buy more seriously into these worlds, even if they maintain their satirical premises. In this regard, the two filmmakers have sort of opposite trajectories, David moving away from the organic and embracing the artifice, and Brandon starting to cover up the artifice for full suspension of disbelief. That's not to say Brandon doesn't maintain an interest in the uncanny and masks the idea of an artificial face over an organic face, but there seems to be an internal battle between these approaches that are working against each other, which reveals some of the weak points in his thematic conceptualization and ability to visually realize these ideas. It would be wrong to call him purely an aesthetic filmmaker, but his films tend to provide fun sensory experiences while having frustratingly one-to-one interpretations, which isn't the case of David's movies' more amorphous thematics. There's something to be said here about elevated horror, the fad term for building a story up from a single metaphor that calls attention to itself, and in doing so restricts interpretations of the horror while having an ostensible vibe of deepness, unlike horror staples of the past which have more universal interpretations, and so ironically don't feel as overtly metaphorical, so to speak, and how that difference might apply generationally to father father and son here. But I think David's films are similarly built up from a central metaphor that calls explicit attention to itself, the difference being that his conceptualization is more complex and forward-thinking. People have likened Brandon's movies to feature-length Black Mirror episodes, and on one hand, I feel like the existence of Black Mirror has become a cultural negative that allows people to reduce any socially conscious, lower sci-fi movie into this box that doesn't really mean anything, which is probably ironic enough to warrant its own separate thought piece. But on the other hand, that reduction can actually be a useful tool for identifying when a work isn't utilizing the medium to transcend the scope of a literary metaphor. And maybe there shouldn't be a responsibility placed on every movie to be so transcendent. There's something to be said for a movie leaning into its small scale as a springboard for an entertaining experience, and in doing so, happening to communicate an idea. But one can't help but look at the tools Brandon's borrowing from his dad and struggling to put together in a way that has as much synergy between form and story and theme. After watching hours and hours of Cronenberg movies, junior and senior, do you ever feel like your eyes are exhausted, or you have trouble going to sleep? What if I told you it's not because of the ungodly images you're watching, but because of the blue light entering your eyes from the screen? With Felix Gray blue light glasses, you can feel those symptoms alleviated, with their proprietary way of filtering blue light that is 15 times more effective than other brands. Out of the over 500,000 customers they have and counting, 9 out of 10 people see an improvement after wearing Felix Gray. Choose from a number of styles from high quality material so that your eyes can feel good, but you can look good too. Like me. I've always wanted to look like the film scholar I pretend to be, and now I can while protecting my vision and preserving my sense of well-being. And hey, if glasses aren't your style, Felix Gray has begun offering contacts that'll help as well. So head over to felixgray.com today and use promo code TWilliams10 at checkout to get 10% off your first pair of glasses. I think the most crucial difference between the two is how they approach the concept of evolution, and I think everything else can be traced back to that. Both filmmakers attempt to telegraph where humanity's heading, but where David sees evolution as a biological necessity for advancement, Brandon sees evolution as a predicted trend of sociological systems, and one of these incorporates the body much more fundamentally than the other. While David has his cautionary tales and adaptations that don't necessarily match the framework, the films of his I'm most interested in use the body horror as a means of communicating growing pains. They show you all the grotesque aspects of a certain change, be it the increase of desensitized violence in media, or digestive systems turning to plastic for nourishment, which for 90% of the runtime feels like a reactionary indictment of new technology and behavioral trends. But by the end, he swings around and convinces you that this pain and discomfort was productive and actually necessary in becoming a more advanced and enlightened species. The mantra of Videodrome, which is still being mulled over, is long live the new flesh, asserting that it's necessary for us to shed our skin and take on a new form in conversation with the media that dominates our lives. A pure separation no longer exists, and some hybrid between the two is the only way forward. Brandon takes a much more pessimistic approach, using the grotesque purely to illustrate the grotesque, certain societal fears that he's basically just used the body horror framework to elevate. Oh hey, there's that word again. Maybe it caught on because it connotes an inherent sense of emphasizing and raising to the audience's face without becoming any more complex or thematically ambitious. For all the interesting world-building ideas in Antiviral about the body and sickness as a vehicle for relationships and quasi-evolution in the form of harvested meat cells outliving our consciousness, what the commentary boils down to is just an indictment of celebrity culture and parasocial relationships. A sociological phenomenon that's evolving the technology in the world while devolving humans themselves and sending us hopelessly spiraling into the ground. The movie ends with a new innovation of celebrity exploitation, while the celebrity herself is robbed of agency, and our protagonist regresses into a child, essentially breastfeeding from the machine. Possessor essentially does the same thing, but with work-life balance and the feeling of splitting your consciousness between all the separate facets of your life, ending with our protagonist spiraling and killing her family, and becoming the ultimate agency-free human tool for her company. And Infinity Pool now does it again, tackling the impunity of the rich and finding a new way to express the gallivanting of the elite via clone execution, an advancement which causes our protagonist to regress into a child, and this time literally breastfeed. God, I need Viggo Mortensen's Freud to come in and analyze how this guy writes an ending. I think there probably is a generational factor that plays into Brandon's more doomer tendencies, but I should clarify that this difference in approaches to evolution is not to say that he's a reactionary by comparison to his dad for not embracing modern advancements. His choice of subject matter is all worth throwing rocks at, but it does feel like all he's really doing is throwing rocks. It doesn't feel as fruitful or productive as commentary, but rather just a translation of the sensory experience of these things. A reskinning, if you will. But not actually a reskinning. Throughout Infinity Pool, Mia Goth constantly goads Alexander Skarsgård on about shedding his skin and embracing his new form, and I can't help but think about Long Live the New Flesh. There's no actual shedding of skin here in terms of body horror, no stomach vagina or anything like that, so it's purely figurative, and all she really means by it is to become one of the fully self-indulging rich people that he's displayed some apprehension to get fully on board with so far. There's a fight between him and his double, which in Cronenberg fashion seems to represent on some level a Freudian dissection of the mind, and has some potential for skin carrying out theme, except the primal dog version of himself seems to represent the id, and it seems strange that the idea here is that killing it would then allow him to embrace his primal self, aka the id. It doesn't really matter because it doesn't really work and he just experiences a sort of ego death after the experience, but the one moment that's supposed to tie the body to the thematic arc gets sort of confused and fizzles out. And then even the masks, which are great designs with their trypophobic flourishes, only really work in service of abstracting cultural appropriation, another exploit of the rich and privileged and ignorant. That's not really new flesh either, nor does it even tie into the idea of skin that Goth keeps talking about. So the parts aren't really communicating with each other here, and the thematic idea it all boils down to is pretty underwhelming. Brandon also has moments that seem to strive to call attention to the medium to point out its own artifice. But again, there's no synergy with the rest of the elements working here. To make another Videodrome comparison, that movie shows us its final shot on a TV the main character's watching and thus consuming, and then it actually happens and we see it just straight up, as now we are the ones consuming these nutrients through the TV. Not only does it call attention to the artifice of the medium, but it takes on a self-reflexive meaning and contextualizes itself as something being consumed by a viewer and finds implications within that relationship regarding our psychology as a species, smearing the line between reality and fiction to posit the media human evolution that's the core subject here. And look, I'm not gonna knock Brandon for not having one of the most brilliant moments I've seen in a movie ever in his movies, but he's like right at the cusp of tying all these things together with the way he sets his films up, and then all he really does is vaguely gesture at it. I will say, to his credit, he's gotten pretty good at using sex as a device for these themes, especially with Infinity Pool. Some of the most interesting aspects of these movies are how they seem to suggest some fucked up psychosexual desires in these repeated patterns, like with all the breastfeeding. And then watching interviews with him, he just seems like a normal guy who grew up on these fucked up movies and writes in that genre because it's familiar. But the level of depravity in this movie extends beyond the realm of fiction, or Skarsgård's dog theatrics. The particular scene I'm talking about kicks off Skarsgård's flagellation parade, and Goth reads him a review of his book that not only sounds similar to popular reviews of Antiviral, but goes on to berate Skarsgård for nepotism himself, which at first seemed to me like a Malcolm and Marie-esque saltiness towards Brandon's own critics, but based on the trajectory of the rest of the movie feels like a straight-up degradation fetish, weaponizing this deep insecurity to blur those lines of reality and create something new and hopefully break off from his father's identity. Or in other words, utilize real-life pain and discomfort in conjunction with media to foster evolution. So in that sense, he's as Cronenbergian as it gets. Is Infinity Pool a successful demonstration of that evolution? A clean break from the staples that weigh him down? No, not really. It's still guilty of all the things I've just talked about, which actually makes that idea of evolution a paradox. If evolving past the framework makes him Cronenbergian, then he hasn't evolved past the framework, and he's not Cronenbergian. But I'm not gonna chase that thread any further. To cut Brandon some slack, I enjoy his movies. And the winner is Brandon Cronenberg, Possessor. I'm sure the last thing he wants is to be a clone of his father, subject to execution from people on the internet. And I'm sure he wants to form his own identity. But the way he repurposes so many of the same tools is impossible to ignore. And in all fairness, it's not like David's early movies are anywhere near his best work, but I think the difference there is that where David slowly developed these tools over the course of his career, Brandon then consequently started out with all of them available right off the bat. It makes me think of a baby learning to talk in a bilingual household, where it's common for it to take longer for them to say their first words because of the stifling dual options, but once they do, they're doubly fluent. I don't know if that analogy entirely applies here. He's got a lot of things down. But this is to say I'm hopeful that Brandon, who again only has 3 movies so far compared to the complexity and intertextuality you get with over 20 movies, will go on to do great things. That's all. As always, links are in the description. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.